My life was a grid. A meticulously designed, perfectly aligned grid of straight lines and right angles, where every day was a precise replica of the one before. I was a graphic designer, and I had bled the principles of my profession into the fabric of my existence. Wake at 6:30. Coffee at 6:45. At my desk by 7:30. Lunch at 12:30. Always the same turkey sandwich. My world was a fortress of routine, built brick by boring brick to keep the chaos of the world and the chaos of my own heart at bay. The walls were high, the gate was locked, and I was the sole, lonely occupant. And then there was Caleb. Caleb was the antithesis of my grid. He was a sweeping curve, a splash of uncontrolled color, a variable I could never account for. He was my roommate Mark's best friend, and he existed in my life as a recurring, beautiful disruption. He was a carpenter, a man who built tangible things with his hands, while I manipulated pixels in the sterile glow of a monitor. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed to strain the fabric of his flannel shirts, and hands that were a roadmap of calluses and small, faded scars. He moved with a quiet, grounded confidence that I could only ever dream of possessing. He was, in the private museum of my mind, the main exhibit, a masterpiece of classical sculpture I was permitted to observe but never, ever touch. The barrier between us felt as solid and insurmountable as museum glass. He was Mark's friend. He was, as far as I could tell from the parade of bright, laughing women who sometimes orbited him, impossibly straight. He was a guest in my home, a temporary fixture, and I was just the quiet, anxious roommate who faded into the background, another piece of minimalist furniture. My admiration for him was a secret I kept locked in the deepest vault of my being, a silent ache that hummed beneath the surface of my orderly days. I cataloged him the way an art historian might study a Renaissance painting. I knew the exact timbre of his laugh, a low rumble that could vibrate through the floorboards from the living room into my studio. I knew the scent that clung to him, a clean, sharp mix of cedar sawdust, coffee, and a simple, nameless soap. I knew the way he'd run a hand through his thick, dark hair when he was puzzling over something Mark said. I knew that he had a small, almost invisible scar just above his left eyebrow. These details were my treasures, hoarded in secret, examined in the quiet of my own mind when the apartment was empty and the silence pressed in on me. He would come over on Tuesdays for dinner and on weekends to watch sports with Mark. I would retreat to my room, the door closed but not quite latched, listening to the cadence of their conversation. Caleb's voice was the anchor, a steady, calm baritone that soothed an anxiety in me I hadn't even realized was there. I'd imagine myself in that room with them, a part of the easy camaraderie, but the thought of it was paralyzing. The risk of exposing the frantic, yearning thing that lived in my chest was too great. So I remained in my fortress, observing from the battlements, safe and utterly alone. My desire was a ghost, haunting the edges of my own life, a silent spectator to the warmth and light that Caleb brought into our apartment. He was a sun, and I was a distant, cold planet, content to watch his glow from a safe, unbreachable distance. The disruption arrived on a Wednesday, carried on the back of a moaning wind and the bruised purple color of the sky. The news called it a storm of the decade, a meteorological beast churning its way toward us. My carefully constructed grid began to tremble. It was Mark who delivered the final, system-shattering blow. He stood in the doorway of my studio, his face pale with worry, phone pressed to his ear. His mother had fallen. A broken hip. He had to go immediately. "I know this is crazy," he said, his voice tight with stress as he ended the call. "But the landlord was just telling me about the pipes in this old building. With this pressure drop, he's worried about them bursting. I can't leave the place empty." My mind was already calculating the disruption. A potential plumbing issue. An inconvenience, but manageable. I could handle it. My fortress was designed for such minor sieges. But then he said the words that brought the whole structure crashing down. "I called Caleb," Mark said, already pulling a duffel bag from his closet. "He's going to come stay here while I'm gone. Just in case. He knows where the main water shutoff is. He'll keep an eye on things." My heart didn't just drop. It plummeted, a stone cast into a bottomless well. Caleb. Here. Not for a few hours of television and pizza, but staying here. Sleeping here. Inhabiting my space, my sanctuary. The main exhibit was being moved out of its climate-controlled gallery and installed directly in my quiet, lonely study. The chaos I had so meticulously walled out was not just at the gate. It had been given a key. I managed a nod, a strangled sound of assent that felt like a betrayal of every rule I had ever made for myself. Mark, oblivious to the cataclysm he had just initiated in my inner world, clapped me on the shoulder. "Thanks, man. You're a lifesaver. He'll be over in an hour." An hour. I had 1 hour to reinforce the walls, to shore up my defenses, to prepare for the invasion. But I knew, with a sinking, terrifying certainty, that it wouldn't be enough. The storm was coming, both outside and in, and my carefully ordered world was about to be washed away. The hour passed in a blur of anxious tidying. I wiped down counters that were already clean. I straightened books that were already perfectly aligned. It was a pointless ritual, a desperate attempt to impose order on a situation that was spiraling into beautiful, terrifying chaos. The doorbell rang, and the sound was like a starting pistol for a race I was not prepared to run. When I opened the door, he was standing there, framed by the darkening sky. Caleb. He had a duffel bag slung over one broad shoulder and a grocery bag in his other hand. Rain clung to his hair and the shoulders of his jacket, and he brought the scent of the storm in with him. Damp earth, ozone, and that underlying clean scent of cedar and soap that was uniquely his. "Hey, Leo," he said, his voice that familiar low rumble. He offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "Sorry to impose." Mark explained the situation. "Yeah. No, it's fine. Come in." My own voice sounded thin, a reedy instrument next to his cello. He stepped inside, and the apartment immediately felt different. Smaller, denser. His presence filled the space, displacing the quiet, sterile air I was used to. He set his bags down, and the grocery bag rustled. "Brought some supplies," he said, pulling out a carton of eggs, a loaf of bread, and a bag of coffee. "Figured we might get snowed in." The "we" hung in the air between us, a word so loaded with implication that I felt my breath catch. We. For the past year, my life had been a singular I. The introduction of a plural was a seismic shift. The storm hit just after sunset. It began with a low whistle of wind that quickly escalated into a mournful howl. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets, and the lights flickered once, twice, before surrendering completely, plunging us into an abrupt, profound darkness. My breath hitched. The last vestige of my normal, ordered world, the electric hum, the steady light, was gone. "Well, that's that," Caleb's voice said, calm and steady in the sudden blackness. I heard a rustle, then the scrape of a match. A tiny flame bloomed, and in its flickering glow, his face was a study in shadow and light. He lit a candle on the coffee table, then another. The warm, unsteady light pushed back the suffocating dark, but it also made the room feel more intimate, a small pocket of warmth against the raging world outside. My senses, already on high alert, went into overdrive. The apartment, which usually smelled of my mild cleaning supplies and the faint scent of paper from my studio, was now dominated by his aroma. The rain on his jacket, the faint, lingering smell of sawdust, the clean scent of his skin. It was everywhere. In the darkness, sounds were magnified. The frantic drumming of the rain, the groan of the old building in the wind, and, underneath it all, the quiet, rhythmic sound of Caleb breathing just a few feet away from me on the couch. It was the most alive sound I had ever heard. He had found a thick wool blanket in the hall closet and draped it over his shoulders. "It's getting cold," he stated simply. He looked at me, shivering slightly in my thin sweater. "There's room under here." It wasn't a question, but it felt like one. An invitation across a small but significant boundary. My mind screamed at me to refuse, to grab my own blanket, to maintain the safe distance I had always kept. But my body, cold and thrumming with a nervous energy I couldn't name, betrayed me. I nodded, my throat too tight for words, and sat down on the far end of the couch. He shifted, lifting the edge of the blanket. I slipped under it, careful to keep a buffer of several inches between us. But the space on the couch was finite. The blanket was heavy. Inevitably, my shoulder brushed against his. The point of contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that shot through the cold fabric of my sweater and straight into my skin. It was nothing, an accidental touch in the dark. But my entire consciousness collapsed into that single point of contact. I could feel the solid muscle of his arm, the radiating heat of his body. It was overwhelming. I was hyper-aware of every tiny movement he made, every shift in his weight, every soft exhale. To fill the charged silence, I asked a stupid question about his work. I expected a short, simple answer. Instead, in the dark, with the storm as our only witness, he started to talk. He spoke about a commission he had been working on for months, a set of custom library shelves, and how the client had backed out at the last minute. "It's not the money," he said, his voice quieter now, losing some of its confident edge. "It's my dad. He was a master carpenter. Everything he touched was perfect. He never thought I had the patience for it. I just wanted this one thing, this one project, to be perfect. To prove him wrong, I guess, even though he's been gone for years." The confession hung in the candlelit air, raw and vulnerable. This wasn't the Caleb I had constructed in my mind, the effortlessly confident, sociable man. This was someone else. Someone with doubts and insecurities. Someone who was still trying to earn the approval of a ghost. The museum glass between us seemed to crack, a fine, hairline fracture. I saw him, for the first time, not as an exhibit, but as a person. And that, I realized with a jolt of panic, was infinitely more dangerous. I found myself murmuring words of comfort, telling him his work was beautiful, that I'd seen the coffee table he'd made for Mark, that it was a work of art. He turned his head to look at me, and in the flickering candlelight, his eyes seemed to hold a question. "Thanks, Leo," he said, his voice soft. That means a lot, coming from you." The distance between us on the couch seemed to shrink to nothing. The buffer zone I had tried to maintain had evaporated. The warmth of his body was a constant, solid presence against my side. The storm raged outside, a symphony of chaos, but in our small, candlelit world, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of quiet intensity and terrifying possibility. The lines of my grid had been completely erased, and I was adrift in an uncharted, unpredictable sea. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to find my way back to shore. The night wore on, and the temperature in the apartment continued to drop. The building's old bones groaned under the assault of the wind, and the wool blanket, once a comfortable luxury, now felt like a necessary tool for survival. We had long since fallen silent, the weight of his confession and my quiet reassurance settling between us, creating a new kind of intimacy that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. I was acutely aware of the rhythm of his breathing, how it had deepened and slowed. I thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, his voice, low and slightly rough, cut through the sounds of the storm. "My room's an icebox. The window seal must be shot." I nodded in the dark, even though he couldn't see me. "The guest room has always been the coldest." A long pause followed. I could feel the tension in it, a question being formed and debated in the space between us. My own heart began to beat a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I knew what was coming next. I could feel it in the charged air, in the subtle shift of his weight beside me. "It's probably stupid," he began, his voice hesitant for the first time all night. "But it would be warmer if we, shared." He didn't specify what. He didn't have to. The suggestion hung there, a massive, terrifying, beautiful thing. Share my bed. My bed. The very center of my fortress, the last bastion of my solitude. My mind, the part of me that had built the walls and enforced the grid, screamed in protest. It was a breach of every protocol, a violation of the highest order. It was madness. "Okay," I heard myself say. The word was a whisper, a ghost of a sound, but it was enough. The journey from the living room to my bedroom felt like crossing a continent. My legs were unsteady, my thoughts a maelstrom. In the dark, I fumbled for the edge of my duvet, pulling it back. The sheets were cold, a stark contrast to the cocoon of warmth we had just left. We slipped into the bed, one on each side, the mattress a vast, empty expanse between us. We lay on our backs for a moment, staring up at the dark ceiling. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, we both rolled onto our sides, facing away from each other. The distance was a chasm, a cold, empty space filled with unspoken things. I could feel the heat radiating from his back, a tantalizing promise of warmth just inches away. I lay there, rigid, my muscles coiled tight. This was a mistake. A terrible, wonderful mistake. I was lying in bed next to Caleb. The thought was so enormous, so impossible, that my brain couldn't fully process it. It was a fantasy, a daydream that had somehow broken through the wall of reality. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the storm outside and the frantic pounding of my own blood in my ears. Then his voice, so close it felt like it was inside my own head. "You okay?" The same question he had asked me years ago, or was it only hours, on the couch. It held a different weight now. It wasn't just about my physical comfort. It was a deeper inquiry. "Are you okay with this? With me? With this impossible situation?" "Yeah," I breathed out, the word barely audible. Another long silence. I felt him shift behind me, the mattress dipping with his movement. The radiating warmth grew closer, more intense. I held my breath, every nerve ending in my body on fire with anticipation and dread. Then I felt it. A touch. His hand, warm and calloused, rested gently on my arm, just above the elbow. It wasn't accidental. There was no pretense. It was a deliberate, questioning touch. An offer. My entire world, my entire life, seemed to hinge on my reaction in that single moment. I could pull away, retreat back to my side of the chasm, and in the morning, we could pretend none of this ever happened. The grid would be restored. The walls would be rebuilt, higher and stronger than before. Or I could stay. I stayed. I didn't move a muscle, but my stillness was its own answer. A surrender, a silent permission. He must have understood, because his hand tightened ever so slightly, a silent reassurance, before he moved again. He rolled fully onto his side, closing the remaining distance between us. His front was now pressed against my back. The heat was overwhelming, a solid wall of warmth that seeped through my t-shirt and into my very bones. His arm slid around my waist, his hand coming to rest on my stomach. He pulled me back against him, fitting my body into the curve of his. My mind simply shut down. The overthinking, the anxiety, the constant internal monologue, it all went silent. All that existed was the feeling of his body against mine, the solid, steady weight of him, the warmth that enveloped me completely. His chin rested on my shoulder, and I could feel his breath, warm and even, against my neck. All my carefully constructed walls, all the rules and routines, didn't just crumble, they evaporated, as if they had never been there at all. In their place was a terrifying, exhilarating void filled only with the presence of this man. This was chaos. This was the end of my ordered world. And as he held me there, a safe harbor in the heart of the storm, I knew with a terrifying, absolute certainty that I never wanted it to end. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, a sliver of gray morning light was filtering through the blinds. The storm had passed. The wind was gone, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence. And I was still wrapped in Caleb's arms. Sometime during the night, I had turned to face him. My head was pillowed on his bicep, my hand resting on his chest. I could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart under my palm. His other arm was still draped over me, holding me close. His face, relaxed in sleep, was only inches from mine. For a few blissful, suspended moments, the reality of it was perfect. The warmth, the safety, the impossible dream made real. I allowed myself to simply exist in that moment, cataloging the new details, the soft stubble on his jaw, the way his dark eyelashes rested against his cheek, the faint scent of sleep and warm skin. Then, his eyes fluttered open. They were a hazy, warm brown, clouded with sleep. They met mine, and for a fraction of a second, there was a look of unguarded softness, a sleepy recognition. Then, awareness dawned. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The arm around me tensed. The easy intimacy of the night evaporated in an instant, replaced by a thick, suffocating awkwardness. He pulled his arms back slowly, deliberately, as if disentangling himself from something dangerous. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, his broad back to me. The sudden absence of his warmth was a physical shock, leaving my side of the bed feeling impossibly cold. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice rough and directed at the floor. He didn't look at me. "Morning," I replied, my own voice a croak. The silence that followed was heavy, jagged. It was a completely different silence from the one we had shared in the dark. That one had been filled with unspoken possibility. This one was filled with unspoken regret. He stood up, grabbing his clothes from the floor, and left the room without another word, closing the door softly behind him. I was left alone in my bed, the sheets tangled and cold, the imprint of his body already fading. And my mind, which had been so blessedly quiet, roared back to life with a vengeance. The anxiety spiral began immediately, a vicious, relentless centrifuge of self-doubt and recrimination. What had I done? He regretted it. Of course, he regretted it. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness brought on by the storm, the darkness, the cold. A fluke. He was just being practical about the warmth, and I had read everything else into it. The touch, the way he held me. I had imagined it all. He was probably disgusted. With me. With himself. I had ruined everything. I wasn't just the quiet roommate anymore. I was the guy who had what? Let him? Encouraged him? Participated in whatever that was. I had crossed a line, and in doing so, I had probably destroyed his friendship with Mark. Mark would come home, and Caleb would tell him what happened, and I would be the weird, predatory roommate. I'd have to move out. I'd have to find a new place to live, a new place to build my walls. The thoughts came faster and faster, each one more catastrophic than the last. I was a fool, a naive, lonely fool who had mistaken a moment of shared human comfort for something more. The museum piece had fallen off its pedestal and shattered, and it was all my fault. I stayed in bed for a long time, paralyzed by the sheer force of my own overthinking, the hum of dread, a physical vibration in my chest. When I finally forced myself to leave the bedroom, the apartment was jarringly normal. The power was back on. The coffee maker was gurgling, filling the kitchen with a rich, familiar aroma. Caleb was standing at the window, staring out at the rain-washed street, a mug cradled in his hands. He was dressed, his hair was damp from a shower, and he looked exactly like the man I had secretly admired for months. But the air between us was charged with a new, unbearable tension. The emotional distance felt like a physical chasm, wider and more impassable than the space on the mattress had ever been. He heard me enter and turned, but his gaze slid past me, focusing on the counter. "Coffee's ready," he said. His tone was polite, neutral, the kind of tone you use with a stranger. It was worse than anger. It was a confirmation of all my fears. He was already rebuilding the walls, erasing the night, putting me back in my designated place. The quiet, invisible roommate. I poured myself a cup, my hands shaking so badly I almost spilled it. We stood in the kitchen on opposite sides of the room, drinking our coffee in a silence so profound it felt like it was screaming. My beautiful, terrible fantasy was over. Now, I just had to survive the wreckage. The day was a slow, agonizing torture. We moved around each other like ghosts, occupying the same space but never truly connecting. We spoke in clipped, functional sentences about the storm damage in the neighborhood, about when Mark might be back. Every polite, meaningless word was another brick in the wall he was building between us. I interpreted his every action through the filter of my anxiety. When he spent an hour on the phone, his back to me, his voice low, I was convinced he was talking to Mark, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. When he went out to check on his truck, I was sure he was just trying to escape the apartment, to get away from me. My fortress was in ruins, and I felt exposed, raw, utterly defenseless. The silence I had once cultivated as a shield now felt like a weapon he was using against me. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I retreated to my room, the scene of the crime, and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed that still faintly smelled of him and surrendered to the misery. I had flown too close to the sun, and now I was falling, my wax wings melted away, with no grid to catch me. All I wanted was to turn back time, to go back to being the silent observer in the museum, admiring him from a safe distance. Because the pain of this proximity, this cold, awkward chasm, was 1,000 times worse than the dull ache of my previous loneliness. Just as I was sinking into the deepest part of my despair, bracing myself for the moment he would pack his bag and leave forever, there was a soft knock on my door. My head snapped up. It was him. It had to be. Leo. His voice was low, muffled by the wood. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The final conversation. The "I'm sorry, but that was a mistake" speech. I braced myself for the impact. Yeah. I managed to call out. The door opened, and he stood there, leaning against the frame. He wasn't looking at me, but at his own hands, which he was rubbing together nervously. The confident, self-assured man was gone. In his place was someone who looked just as uncertain and anxious as I felt. "We should talk," he said, his voice quiet but firm. There it was, the dreaded phrase. I nodded, unable to speak, and gestured numbly to the chair in the corner of my room. He ignored it, instead walking over to the window, mirroring the posture he'd held all morning. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the street, gathering his thoughts. The silence stretched, and with every passing second, my certainty of impending rejection solidified. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it. "I've been an idiot all day." It wasn't what I expected. I waited, my breath held tight in my chest. "I'm sorry," he continued, turning from the window to finally look at me. His eyes were filled with an emotion I couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity or disgust. It was something else. Something that looked a lot like fear. The way I've been acting. Distant. I freaked out, Leo. I woke up this morning, and it was real, and it terrified me. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words. He was the one who was terrified. "For months," he said, taking a hesitant step closer. "I've been watching you. The way you focus when you're working. The way you have this quiet, self-contained thing about you. I would make excuses to come over, just to be in the same room as you, hoping you might. I don't know. Look at me. Really look at me." The confession stunned me into silence. He had been watching me. "I've never felt this way about a guy before," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It's confusing, and I kept telling myself it was impossible. You were always so reserved, so in your own world. I was sure you weren't interested, or that you were straight. I saw all those women I'm friends with, my cousin, my business partner. I think I surrounded myself with them, like some kind of camouflage, so no one, especially not you, would see what was really going on." He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was standing right in front of me. "Last night, the storm was just an excuse. I told Mark I'd stay. I was hoping for a chance, any chance, to break through that wall you keep up. And when I did, it was more than I ever expected, and it scared the hell out of me. This morning, all I could think was that I'd pushed too hard, that you regretted it, that I had completely misread everything." The dam inside me broke. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. All the anxiety, all the catastrophic scenarios I had built in my head, they all dissolved in the face of his raw, vulnerable honesty. "No," I whispered, finding my voice at last. "I didn't regret it. I thought you did." I told him everything then. About the museum, about cataloging the sound of his voice and the scent of sawdust. About how I thought he was this untouchable, impossible thing. About how I'd spent the entire day convinced I had ruined his life and his friendship with Mark. About how terrified and thrilled I had been when he'd held me. A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, a sunrise after the longest night. "A museum piece?" he asked, a hint of that gentle, teasing humor in his voice. He reached out, his hand coming up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The touch was no longer questioning or hesitant. It was sure. It was certain. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to do this." He leaned in, and his lips met mine. This kiss was nothing like the first one. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was a kiss of profound relief, of shared understanding. It was deep and sure, and tasted of coffee and confession and the promise of a new beginning. It wasn't the chaotic end of my world. It was the feeling of a world finally, impossibly, clicking into place. It felt like coming home. In the days that followed, we moved through the apartment in a new orbit, drawn together by a quiet, powerful gravity. When Mark returned, none the wiser about the tectonic plates that had shifted in his absence, we kept our new reality a secret. It became a warm, glowing ember we shielded between us. A secret language spoken in shared glances across the dinner table, a silent conversation that Mark was never privy to. It was in the way Caleb's hand would find mine under the table at a restaurant, his fingers lacing through mine, a hidden anchor in a public space. It was in the soft brush of his shoulder against mine in the hallway, a touch that was no longer accidental, but a deliberate, private message. Our first real date was a quiet affair. We walked along the river as the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. The world was muted, and for the first time, I felt like I was an active participant in its beauty, not just an observer. We talked for hours, filling in the vast, empty spaces of what we didn't know about each other. I learned about his childhood in a small town, about the treehouse his father helped him build, the one that sparked his love for wood. He learned about my anxieties, my fear of open spaces and loud noises, the reasons I had built my fortress in the first place. He didn't try to fix me or tear down my walls. He simply listened, and then he showed me that it was safe to open the gate. The intimacy between us deepened in small, quiet moments. It was him bringing me a cup of coffee in the morning, made exactly how I liked it, without me ever having to tell him. It was me leaving a new, high-quality wood file on his workbench, a silent acknowledgement of his passion. It was the way we could sit in comfortable silence in the living room, me sketching in my notebook, him reading a book, the air between us peaceful and content, no longer charged with unspoken tension, but humming with a quiet, steady connection. He slowly, patiently, redrew the map of my world, replacing the rigid grid with soft curves and gentle, winding paths that all led back to him. One evening, a few weeks later, we were watching a movie on the couch. A light rain had started to fall, tapping softly against the window panes. Caleb turned to me, a conspiratorial grin playing on his lips, his eyes twinkling in the soft glow of the television. "The forecast says more rain tonight," he said, his voice a low, playful rumble. "Should I be worried about the pipes?" Laughter bubbled up inside me, genuine and unforced. The inciting incident, the source of so much terror and anxiety, had been transformed into our first inside joke. The storm that I thought would destroy me had, in fact, been my salvation. It had washed away the old structures, clearing the ground for something new and infinitely more beautiful to be built in their place. I leaned into him, resting my head on his solid shoulder, the same place where I had once felt the first electric shock of contact. "I think," I said, smiling against the warm fabric of his shirt, "we can handle it." I looked around my apartment, at the familiar lines and angles. It was the same space, the same furniture, the same four walls. But it felt entirely different. The silence was no longer a symbol of my isolation. It was a peaceful canvas for our shared quiet. The order I had clung to so desperately hadn't been erased, but it had become flexible, adaptable. It could now accommodate an extra pair of work boots by the door, the scent of cedar mingling with the smell of my ink pens, the low rumble of his voice becoming the new, steady baseline of my life. For so long, I had believed that safety lay in solitude, that vulnerability was a weakness to be avoided at all costs. I had built a life that was neat and predictable and achingly lonely. I had been the curator of my own empty museum. Caleb didn't just breach my walls. He showed me that the point of walls isn't to keep everyone out, but to create a space safe enough to let the right person in. He was the beautiful, terrifying chaos I had been so afraid of, and embracing him, letting him into the carefully ordered grid of my life, had not resulted in destruction. It had resulted in connection, in joy, in a quiet, steady warmth that I knew, with an unshakable certainty, was the foundation of home. The risk had been immense, but the reward was everything.